The Nommo are primordial ancestral spirits in Dogon religion and cosmology, though some researchers are convinced that they may in fact be aliens. In one story of the Dogon of West Africa, an ark descended to the ground, bringing advanced amphibious beings known as the Nommo. These beings gave the Dogon advanced information about an invisible companion to the star Sirius, which was extremely heavy and made of a special metal not found on Earth. It would one day be known to astronomers as Sirius B. The Dogon are an ethnic group of around 600,000 people, most of who live in the rocky hills, mountains and plateaus of the Bandiagara escarpment in the Middle Plateau region of Mali. The ancestors of the Dogon came from the area of Mande in southwest Mali and northeast Guinea that was the center of the 13th century Mali Empire. After the collapse of this empire, the Dogon migrated to their current rocky home. The cliffs and difficult terrain where the Dogon settled offered effective protection from raids by slave traders coming from the desert, though they also resulted in the isolation of communities. When Mali became a part of French West Africa in the 1890s, the slave raids ended, and the Dogon were able to expand into the plains around the plateau. Unfortunately, this migration separated the Dogon from their religious sites, making room for Islam and Christianity. But the Dogon are still known for their intricate cosmology and extraordinary rituals that go with it. Their mask dances are now tourist attractions. Indeed, after a mask has been used in these ritualist celebrations, it is no longer considered sacred and is often sold to tourists. Dogon religion is devoted mainly to worshipping the ancestors and the spirits they encountered when they migrated across the western Sudan. For every 60 years, the Dogon perform a religious ceremony called the Sigwi, corresponding to the duration of the life of the first Dogon ancestor. The ceremony occurs when the star Sirius appears between two mountain peaks and is celebrated over 7 years, during which time the great mask is carved from a single piece of wood. These masks are incredibly tall and symbolically complex, and their elaborate dance reenacts the creation of the Dogon culture. This and all Dogon ceremonies are organized by members of the Awa, a male initiation society with important ritual and political roles within the Dogon society. Our society members are also responsible for the creation and performance of the masks, all of which portray the face as a rectangular box with deeply hollowed channels for the eyes. Sirius, also known as the Dog Star in the constellation Canis Major, is the brightest star in the night sky. The bright part of the binary is a blue-white star, 25.4 times as luminous as the Sun. Sirius was known as Sothis to the ancient Egyptians, who knew that it made its first heliacal rising, rose just before sunrise, of the year at around the time of the annual floods were beginning in the Nile Delta. In ancient Rome and Greece, the hottest part of the year was connected with the heliacal rising of the Dog Star, an association that remains in the expression Dog Days. That Sirius as a binary star was first reported by the German astronomer Friedrich Wilhelm Bessel in 1844. The companion was first seen in 1862 by Alvan Clark, an American astronomer and telescope maker, and came as a complete surprise to astronomers. Sirius B is 10,000 times dimmer than Sirius. Consequently, it's extremely difficult to see from Earth. In fact, astronomers were not able to estimate its mass until 2005, when they were able to use data from the Hubble Space Telescope. From 1931 to 1956, French anthropologist Marcel Gréal and his student Germaine Detelen worked in Mali and lived among the Dogon, mainly by talking to a blind hunter named Ogotemeli. They found that some elements of the tribe's mythology were similar to that of ancient Egypt, especially the importance of Sirius in their traditions. The pair also discovered that the Dogon possessed impressive knowledge of certain aspects of modern astronomy. This knowledge included the belief that the Earth and other planets rotate on their axis and orbit the Sun, that Jupiter possesses 4 moons, and that Saturn is surrounded by a ring. Although this is impressive, such information can be obtained without modern technology, as can be seen by the work of ancient Greek astronomers and Copernicus. But it's not this knowledge that is the source of the controversy surrounding the Dogon. The cause of the debate was the claim that Ogotomeli told the anthropologist that the Dogon believed that Sirius, in their language Sigutolu, has a dark, invisible companion with a 50-year elliptical orbit. This companion is extremely heavy and made of a special metal not found on Earth. In other words, Sirius B. Apparently around 15% of all Dogon adult males were initiated into the Sirius lore. But how could a remote people who lacked any kind of astronomical device obtain such information about an invisible star? Krill first published this extraordinary data on the Dogon in 1948 and included it in a representation of the Sirius B system drawn by Ogotomeli. One theory to explain the advanced astronomical knowledge of the Dogon was put forward by author Robert Temple in his book The Sirius Mystery, first published in 1976. An advertisement for its second 1998 edition, called The Sirius Mystery: New Scientific Evidence of Alien Contact 5,000 Years Ago, stated Temple's extreme hypothesis about the Dogon and Sirius B. He said, "Convincing evidence that the Egyptian, Sumerian and Dogon civilizations were founded by aliens from the Sirius star system who are now ready to return. New scientific evidence that solidifies the hypothesis that the KGB, CIA and NASA attempted to suppress. An awe-inspiring work of research that calls for a profound reappraisal of our role in the universe." The Sirius Mystery in 1976 set the world abuzz with talk of an extraterrestrial origin to human civilization and triggered a 15-year persecution campaign against Robert Temple by the KGB, CIA and NASA and other government agencies. Undaunted, however, Temple is back with 140 pages of new scientific evidence that makes his hypothesis more compelling than ever. Many authors have speculated on the subject of extraterrestrial contact, but never before has such detailed evidence been presented. Temple applies his in-depth knowledge of ancient history, mythology, Pythagorean physics, chaos theory, and Greek to a close examination of the measurements of the Great Pyramid of Giza, which was built to align directly with the star Sirius. He concludes that the alien civilization of Sirius and our own civilization are part of the same harmonic system and are destined to function and resonate together. His findings warrant a profound reappraisal of our role in the universe. Temple's book also states that thousands of years ago an ark descended to the ground with great noise and in a swirling wind and brought amphibious alien beings known as the Nommo to the Dogon. It was these beings who told the tribesmen about Sirius B. The Dogon were also told that the Nommo lived on a planet that orbits another star in the Sirius system. This account follows Dogon mythology fairly closely. In Dogon tradition, Nommo was the creator spirit who emerged with a female twin and several more pairs of Nommo from the cosmic egg Amma. The first Dogon primordial ancestors were thus bisexual water gods created in heaven by Amma and descended from heaven to earth in an ark. Many scientists reacted to Temple's claims by saying that the advanced knowledge about Sirius probably came from Western visitors who discussed astronomy with the Dogon priests. The priests then added this new information to their older traditions. They also pointed out that Grail was an amateur astronomer and could well have used his knowledge to rationalize the rather disorganized Dogon traditions that even tribal members could not agree on. In 1995, two French researchers, Daniel Benest and J.L. Duvent, had an article published in the journal Astronomy and Astrophysics entitled "Is Sirius a Triple Star?", which suggested that there was a small third star in the Sirius system. They believe the star may be a type known as a red dwarf and probably has only about 0.5 the mass of Sirius B. Some researchers have wondered, could this newly discovered star be the home of the Nommo? One of the greatest archaeological mysteries is the discovery of giant skeletons in 3 western states: California, Arizona, and Nevada. The huge remains found in large stone sarcophagus, caves, and Pueblo burial grounds predate the Native Americans in many cases. Some tribes worshipped men of huge stature who inhabited the region before they arrived. Who were these giants? When did they exist? What happened to them? In 1833, soldiers uncovered a particular level of gravel and stone cement in Lompoc Rancho near Point Conception, California. When the workers broke through it, they were startled to find the skeleton of a 12-foot-long man. This giant had been buried in a massive stone coffin. On closer inspection, the men found that the giant possessed a double row of both upper and lower teeth. Relics buried with the skeleton included several huge stone axes and 2 giant spears. More bones of a giant were excavated on Santa Catalina Island. Accompanying the man were the charred remains of a small species of elephant, which he evidently had roasted. Incidentally, the big guy ate that elephant with a double row of choppers, both upper and lower. But what is the significance of these elephant remains? Remarkably, it suggests that the giant lived there at least 10,000 years ago, the age at which American mammoths became extinct. Elsewhere on Santa Rosa Island, someone found a skeleton of a giant which not only had double rows of teeth, but also artifacts identical to those found at Lompoc Rancho, such as massive stone axes and enormous spears. Similarly, on Santa Cruz Island, another giant skeleton was found. This one was sent to the National Science Foundation in Washington, D.C. However, it was promptly misplaced. Furthermore, at Santa Barbara, a cave full of giant skeletons was found. Unfortunately, the entrance to the cave was sealed shut before proper excavation could be conducted. In 1895, the Chicago Record reported that fossilized remains of men and women who had been 8 to 9 feet tall were found in California. More importantly, their bones were found in the same rock layer as those of extinct mammoths like the bones from Santa Catalina. Earlier in 1891, Crittenden, Arizona, workers were excavating the remains of an old building when they came across an enormous stone sarcophagus at a depth of 8 feet. When archaeologists opened the tomb in front of a large, curious crowd which had gathered, the scientists found a huge mummy case which had been built with blocks of red rose granite. When it was broken open, everyone was disappointed to see only a handful of dust, all that remained of an ancient giant whom the ages had pulverized. Everybody agreed that it had taken a long time for a skeleton to dissolve into dust, particularly in the dry desert. This fact would make the giant much older than the California specimens whose skeletons were found intact. Although not a single bone or artifact was found, the inside of the mummy case had been carved in a likeness of the body, a characteristic reminiscent of Egyptian sarcophagus. According to the carving and the size of the enormous container, the body had once measured 12 feet in length and had 6 toes on each foot. Now the story moves into Nevada, the last state where numerous giant remains have been found. In 1871, Charles Billinger, a writer for the Los Angeles Times, wrote an article in which he described giants found in a cave near Lovelock, Nevada. His article went as follows. In 1812, James Hart and David Push uncovered the first of many giant remains whilst digging manure in the Lovelock Cave. These mummies were red-headed and averaged 6 to 7 feet in height, a slightly shorter version of the 8 to 12 feet footers found elsewhere. Many archaeologists and anthropologists have since come to examine the smoke-stained cave, which is located 22 miles from the town of Lovelock. Attempts to date the remains have resulted in ages ranging from 3000 BC to 1850 AD. The caves were occupied for nearly 500 years, but no artifacts or skeletons except those of the giants have been found. The giants resided in this cave for many centuries until the Puyallup Indians, distressed by the giants' bad habits, annihilated them. What provoked this sudden annihilation? Sarah Winnemucca, a direct descendant of Chief Truckee, the last king of the Paiutes, wrote a book of history and legend of the Paiutes. These stories may help to unravel the mystery. One story claimed that about 100 years before her birth, there was another race sharing the Paiute homeland. This race was called the Sidiokas, which in the Paiute language means man-eaters or cannibals. These giant cannibals had flaming red hair. For sport, they would dig traps in well-traveled trails and wait for some unsuspecting Paiute to fall to his death. Then they would have a grand feast. Needless to say, these actions did not make for friendly relations, and war soon broke out between the two tribes. In the midst of a battle, the giants would leap from behind cover, grab Paiute arrows in mid-flight and then fire them back at the opposition from their own bows. Unfortunately for the giants, they were greatly outnumbered, so the war did not last long. Later, in an attempt to escape from the Paiutes, the Sidiokas constructed large canoes from tule fibers and lived on Humboldt Lake. When their supplies ran out, they hid in the Lovelock Cave. The Paiutes surrounded the entrance to the cave and killed the giants when they ventured out at night in search of water. This proved to be slow work, so the Paiutes stuffed the cave entrance with wood and set it on fire, thereby smothering all those within and bringing about a quick end to the war. And with that, this tribe of brave, strong and intelligent giants that apparently lived in one region for 5,000 years had been exterminated by the migratory Paiutes in about 1750. During the 3-year war, the entire population of giants were killed, which was estimated by the Paiutes to number 2,600. Annie Bill, a 68-year-old resident of Lovelock and a niece of Sarah Winnemucca, testifies that her grandparents saw the giants and had described them as having long faces and white-skinned. Nowadays, only 300 Paiutes still survive in the Lovelock area. They claim to have always known that remains would be found in the cave. In fact, they were often told white settlers what the cave contained, but of course they were laughed at. After years of ridicule, the Paiute finally kept the knowledge to themselves, at least until they were vindicated by modern science. Other remnants of the giants include relics that have survived, kept by members of the tribe for many years. Winnemucca claimed, "I have some of their hair, which has been handed down from father to son. I have a dress, which has been in our family for many years, trimmed with reddish hair." For further physical evidence, we turn to Stoker's Museum in nearby Winnemucca. The proprietor, Clarence Stoker, a Lovelock native, has participated in several excavations of the cave. His museum is stocked with arrowheads, nets and baskets, in addition to a skull of one of the giants. His prize artifact is a calendar stone from the cave, marked with 52 indicators on the inside of the stone for the weeks, 365 on the outside for days. Despite these findings, the mystery remains. What were the origins of these giants? Where did they come from? One explanation, as offered by Stoker, suggested they were descendants of Egyptians who sailed to America hundreds of years ago. Stoker backed up this by continuing, "Didn't Thor Heyerdahl just prove the possibility that Egyptians may have sailed to America as long as 4,000 years ago on reed rafts? This indeed is the case." Furthermore, giants who colonized Ecuador 4,000 years ago arrived on reed rafts. Also, the Sidiokas sailed on Humboldt Lake in reed canoes they built. Although hundreds of mummies and tons of artifacts have been recovered from the cave, there are a few positive indications of Egyptian influence. However, the giants could easily have retained their cultural heritage and knowledge while their original implements quickly wore out. In explaining the mummies, which should only have been skeletons, anthropologist Robert F. Heiser of the University of Southern California commented, "Conditions of extreme dryness in the cave, as in the pyramids of Egypt, have preserved the archaeological material in remarkable good fashion." In fairness, it should be stated that Mr. Heiser did not infer a connection between Egypt and the Lovelock giants, but only a slight comparison. It seems the mystery of the giants will continue. We may hypothesize that they arrived in the West about 3,000 years ago from either South America or Egypt, and that they were eventually destroyed by Native Americans. Unfortunately, that is all the knowledge we have currently obtained. Perhaps one of America's greatest archaeological mysteries will remain just that, a mystery, though fortunately that uncertainty isn't stopping the continuing search. It's believed that all or maybe most living beings on our planet are well known and studied in detail by biologists, but this is not the case. Scientists are studying only one form of life on our planet, the protein life, but there is another life which is a cluster of the physical field. You look up at the sky on a clear day and it seems that it's absolutely clear, but it lives its own life invisible to people. It's literally teeming with strange objects, visible only in the bright rays of the sun. The whole sky is filled with them. Interestingly, objects are said to move only in one direction, bottom to top, with different angles at different speeds. The sizes of the objects are also different, but the speed of movement is very fast. The flight path of objects, as well as the speed with which they move, makes it possible to exclude the possibility that these are plant seeds or insects, according to some Russian researchers who were trying to film them not that long ago. Millions of strange objects are not visible to the human eye. Even a video camera is only able to see them if they are illuminated by the rays of the sun. What are they? Perhaps these are so-called plasmoids. Plasmoids, an energetic form of life that exists on Earth in parallel with the human civilization. This is a plasma system structured by its own magnetic field. Plasma is hot ionized gas. An example of this is ordinary fire. Plasma has the ability to dynamically interact with the magnetic field to keep the field in itself, and the field in turn orders the chaotic motion of charged plasma particles. Under certain conditions, a stable but dynamic system consisting of a plasma and a magnetified field can form. There is a hypothesis that plasmoids are one of the life forms that have existed on our planet for billions of years. In Western Europe, legends have been circulating since ancient times about fires that paralyzed the consciousness of a person and taken them away with it. Some researchers believe that the glowing spheres may have an alien origin. Human beings have encountered this life since their appearance on Earth, but we still know very little about them. If human beings can be called a ruler of the surface of the Earth, then according to some Russian researchers, this non-protein life can rightly be called the rulers of the planet's bowels and the sky above. The creatures that inhabit the Earth's firmament, and sometimes break out of it into the sky, possess varying names, but they have the same essence. In ancient times, they were considered the embodiment of the element of fire. Fire elementals, most often in historical chronicles with these elements of fire, appear as fire spheres. There was a Roman historian, Ammianus Marcellinus, and he described the appearance of the fire elementals in the year 362 AD, or Common Era. Fireballs descended from the sky and burned all the workers who were trying to restore the temple in Jerusalem. Ammianus Marcellinus was born around 330 to 400 AD, or Common Era. He was one of the last of the great Latin pagans historians of antiquity. He spoke about Jews in 4 separate passages of the history. The first one refers to Pompey's conquest of Jerusalem. In the second, he quotes the disparaging remarks of Marcus Aurelius regarding the Jewish people. But most importantly is the third passage, which contains a description of the attempt of Julian the Apostate to rebuild the temple in Jerusalem. He ascribes that this is not due to sympathy with the Jews, but because of the emperor's desire to leave a memorial to his reign. According to Marcellinus, the project was entrusted to a certain Alypius of Antioch, but it couldn't be executed because of an explosion of balls of fire on the Temple Mount. Julian the Apostate, Flavius Claudius Julianus, lived in the Common Era. He was a Roman emperor, and the story is extremely interesting, but in the 20th century descriptions of elementals took on a much more mundane appearance. But also, more specific, they were even captured on video camera. For example, on September the 12th at 9 o'clock in the evening, near the Russian village of Basia, Udoli, the car of Dmitry Regan, a paranormal researcher, got stuck in the mud. The researcher himself described his encounter with a fiery creature. The fireballs sometimes moved slightly away behind low clouds and hung against the background of an almost black sky. It was about a third of the size of the moon's disk, but it didn't change shape. Its size to the optics of the TV camera. You could see its loose structure like cells of different shapes and sizes. I calmly filmed it for about 20 minutes. Fireballs floating in the air are common on Earth, but not ubiquitous. They definitely love some areas, and in those areas, the fireballs sometimes arrange real parades. Shigli became one of such zones favored by these fiery objects. The Shigli Mountains, or simply Shigli, are a range of wooded mountains located in Russia on the right bank of the Volga River inside the Samara Band. The Shigli are considered the only tectonically active mountains in eastern Russia. That's important. First having formed around 7 million years ago, the summits and other exposed areas of the Shigli are composed of limestone and dolomite sediments laid down 230 to 350 million years ago in the Permian and Carboniferous regions. For several years in a row, Samara, that's a city in Russia, a group of local historians came here to collect stories of local residents about their encounters with fiery entities. Local historians were lucky on one of these summer nights that they actually saw a real air parade over Shigli. Here's what one of the participants of the expedition wrote in his diary on August the 15th, 1990. At about 22 hours, I, as well as several of my comrades, observed a group of fireballs flying over the Shigli. Ahead of the group flew a large single ball with a small tail, followed by 9 smaller balls of spheres. They flew in a row of 3, shimmering with bright and long tails. Many of them believe that the fire elementals do not exist, and poetic stories about meeting with strange fiery objects that behave like living beings or are inspired by ancient myths and fairy tales, or just eyewitnesses of such meetings for the first time saw very ordinary ball lightning. Here's how the Canadian professor Michael Persinger explains the appearance of fire objects, balls and pillars. In the course of natural processes from a scientific point of view, these are fire objects that frighten people. They're born underground. Even very weak tectonic movements lead to mechanical stresses in siliceous rocks. Electricity is generated, which, given their huge mass, can reach a significant value. Under its influence, a column of ionized air over the section of rocks can twist around the axis. As a result, it creates ball lightning bolts that have sizes from a few centimeters to 1 to 2 meters. Maybe what witnesses had seen over the tectonically active Shigli was that. But, you see, not all the appearances of fireballs can be explained by natural causes. Russian researchers of the unknown who followed the mission Kazanchev have long been talking about the possibility of the existence of beings on our planet. The basis of life for these beings are energy fields. It's likely that the energy life forms were able to reach a high level of their development and are not predatory jellyfish floating in the oceans of air, but actually intelligent beings. In some Eastern mystical manuscripts that have come down to our time, for example, in a ball of fire, it's said that the existence on Earth of intelligent races that do not have a solid body, but are fire clusters. Russian researchers say that we must accept the idea that on Earth we don't know protein nucleic life well enough as energy beings can exist next to it. Moreover, encounters with them can end in tragedy. True, they can exist only in energetically active areas of the planet, in conditions of constant energy supply, primarily in places where powerful electromagnetic currents reach the Earth's surface, for example in the magnetic poles of the planet. Yuri Kashinov, a member of the Soviet expedition to the South Pole, recalled his meeting with such creatures. Kashinov lived in Leningrad. Shortly before his death, he told a journalist a story that he had kept secret for a long time. There's no wonder, because for such things in the USSR they were forbidden. If you did, you were put in a mental asylum. In 1959, the Soviet expedition that established the Mir station in Antarctica sent a group of 6 explorers deep into the continent to reach the South Magnetic Pole. Only 2 of them returned. In the end, Kashinov recalled, they decided to tell the truth about what had happened. To his surprise, they believed them, but there was no convincing evidence. So what happened in 1959? The Soviet expedition for 3 weeks reached the South Magnetic Pole, and everything was going too well, Kashinov recalled. Troubles began for the expedition the next morning. 300 meters away from the all-terrain vehicle, a glowing ball jumped out of nowhere. The photographer of the expedition, Alexander Garadetsky, went forward with a camera in his hand. A glowing halo appeared around Garadetsky, and he screamed horribly. 2 shots rang out, and the group's senior officer, Andrei Kobylev, and the expedition's doctor, Rauman Kustov, were the ones who fired at the glowing ribbon. It swelled, sparks flew in all directions, and it disappeared with an explosion. Garadetsky lay dead. The back of his head, hands and back were charred. The glowing orbs reappeared on the path 2 days later. They appeared suddenly at an altitude of about 100 meters, then slowly descended, approaching the team. Kustov and Borissa started firing their rifles, and when Kashanov recovered from the shock, the balloon orbs were gone, and there was a smell of ozone in the air, as if after a severe thunderstorm. Kustov and Borissa lay dead in the snow, and the commander of the detachment, Andrei Kobylev, stood with his hands pressed to his eyes. He couldn't remember anything and didn't see anything, and sadly died on his return to the Mera station. Unicorns, those iconic one-horned creatures. Big and beastly, or cute and cuddly? Many consider them to be nothing more than mythological, but could they have once roamed the earth? Let's go back in time to the 5th century BC, and the Greek writer Herodotus. He spoke of a horned ass that lived in Africa. His speculation is still supported by some writers, but all along he was probably referring to an antelope rather than a unicorn. Greek physician Tsisu described wild asses as large as horses or even larger, with a cubit horn in their forehead. A cubit's length can vary from that of a forearm to around a yard. He also said that drinking cups made from the horn prevented people from suffering convulsions, epilepsy, and poisoning. Despite his description, some believe that he was referring to a rhinoceros. Around 500 years later, Julius Caesar came across an ox that looked like a stag. He described it as having a single horn between its ears, taller and straighter than the usual animal horns with which we are familiar. He adds that the top of the horn spreads out like the palm of a hand or branches of a tree. It's intriguing to think that Caesar might have come across a unicorn, although sadly, according to Carol Hammond's translation of the Gallic Wars by the Oxford University Press, the Roman leader wasn't actually very knowledgeable about the animal kingdom. For example, he claimed that elk had no joints in their legs, when obviously they have. Hammond also states that Caesar's method for capturing elk is wholly erroneous. If that wasn't enough, she also states that he describes an animal that can only be a reindeer. In all fairness to Caesar, he isn't the only one who got it wrong. It's possible that he simply saw the reindeer from an unusual angle, which sparked his belief in the unicorns. So, in John Napier's book, Bigfoot, it's proposed that the unicorn legend stems from the Arabian oryx, a creature with an impressive set of horns. And if you look at a photo from a particular angle, it can seem as if it only has a single horn. Chris Lavers writes in his book, The Natural History of Unicorns, that other animals with similar features and seen from misleading angles can easily be mistaken for unicorns, thus sparking the myth. Unicorns don't seem to be the only curious creatures that roam the earth. Andrew Battelle, a sailor from Essex, describes witnessing a mysterious creature during one of his voyages. He reports of an ape, giant in stature, with a man's face, but no hair on the face and ears. The beast's hair was not very thick, and it covered him from head to toe. According to Battelle, the creature often kills natives in the woods and can't be defeated. He says they're so strong that 10 men cannot hold one of them. Was Battelle referring to the Australian yowie, or a yeti? Bigfoot, perhaps? The descriptions are very similar. According to Colin Groves, a former teacher at Cambridge University, the report is mixed up with all kinds of misinformation. For example, biologists first discovered gorillas in 1847 and the mountain gorilla in 1902. Battelle died in 1614, so the beast he saw on his voyage was probably one of those. Descriptions can be distorted by time and misinformation, much like a game of Chinese whispers. Therefore, it's no surprise that even the best cryptobiologists struggle with the identification of unusual animals. It's inevitable that there are species we haven't yet discovered. In his book Bigfoot, Napier states that the mountain lion is widespread from British Columbia to Patagonia in quite large numbers, yet it's so elusive that few people have seen it in the wild. In 1663, excavators in Germany's Harz Mountains near Quedlinburg found a skeleton in the rock. The highly respected scientist Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz One of the fathers of calculus claimed that this was a quadrupled unicorn native to Abyssinia. Reporting the find, Leibniz, in his book Proto-Geo, stated that the skeleton's head had a horn as long as 5 human forearms and nearly as thick as a human leg at the base, tapering to a point. He claims that as the fossil was removed from the rock, it was damaged and the remains, the head, the horns, the spine and some ribs were presented to local nuns. At the time, unicorn horns were sold as cures for the plague, poisoning and rabies. They were worth a fortune, and so it became a money-making scheme for apothecaries and conmen. According to the Gull's Horn book written by Thomas Dekker, a unicorn's horn was worth half a city. Another notable scientist of the time, Johann Jakob Scheuer, supported his conclusions. The remains have since been inspected, and rather than being Leibniz's quadrupled unicorn, they're actually the bones and single tusk of an elephant. But why did Leibniz and Scheuer get it so wrong? Why would they mistake an elephant's skeleton for a unicorn's? Both men surely knew of elephants, and Leibniz was a skillful fossil collector. Furthermore, looking at the pictures, the features seem biologically unlikely. The tailbone touches the ground, there are no rear legs, and the spine is back to front. As we can now see, many biologists believe that the misidentification of existing animals probably led to the creation of unicorn stories. But is it possible that unicorns existed at some point? If we go back and look at the history of many real prehistoric creatures, a pony with a horn seems tame in comparison. For example, one ancient relative of the California condor weighed roughly 80 kilograms with a wingspan of 6.5 to 7 meters, whereas the largest modern-day bird weighs around 8 to 14 kilograms with wingspans of only 3 to 3.5 meters. The giant beaver was 2.5 meters long with a grand weight of 150 to 200 kilograms. And while out on the voyage of the beagle, Charles Darwin stumbled across the fossil of a toxodon, a giant guinea pig. In a letter to his sister, Darwin noted, "The skull is as large as a rhinoceros, which, as far as they can guess, must have been a gnawing animal. Conceive a rat or hare of such a size, what famous cats they ought to have had in those days." Darwin wasn't wrong, saber-toothed cats were roaming North America. Another example is the great Irish elk. At 2.1 meters tall, the beast weighed 40 kilograms with antlers spreading to around 3.7 meters. Their antlers may, eventually, have become so excessively large that they directly led to the creature's extinction. Research shows that elks had trouble with feeding and holding their head up. Some would even get entangled among the trees because of the size of their antlers. It's argued that growing antlers so large would require increased amounts of food. Climate change was happening during the time of the elk's extinction. Perhaps there was no longer enough food to feed both them and their gigantic antlers. Another example is the mammoth. If these woolly beasts were roaming the earth as little as 3,700 years ago, then what's to say that mystical beauties with huge horns weren't? Throughout history, conflicting stories and observations may have contaminated the legend. Could this have led to the confusion between reindeers and unicorns in the Gallic Wars? But could genetics be relevant? In 2008, a 10-month-old deer was born at the Central of Natural Sciences in Italy, but this was no ordinary deer. In the middle of his forehead was a single horn. Perhaps there was a mutation caused by inbreeding. Could this be our source of the unicorn myth? It's very possible, considering that inbreeding is one reason why we've got so many varieties of dog. Dachshunds, for example, have very short legs, which isn't unlike achondroplasia, a genetic disease that causes short-limbed dwarfism in humans. Tales, folklore, and misidentifications all help to create the legend of the unicorn. They might not exist as the mythical beast depicted in literature, but there's so much evidence to suggest that they are, or were, once here on Earth. One thing is for sure, for cryptobiologists and countless little girls, the unicorn is here to stay. The story of Alashenka, the alien baby discovered near a small village in Russia, is without doubt one of the most unsettling but curious accounts on record. One that would result in missing evidence, strange and questionable deaths, and unanswered questions. Indeed, the account of Alashenka, including just who or what this strange creature was, remains as much of a mystery now as it did at the time it unfolded. According to most reports, one hot summer evening in 1996, in the small Russian village of Kyolenori near Kitsum, Russia, an elderly lady named Tamara was walking in the woods when she heard what she first believed was a small animal moving around in the trees. She turned to try to locate the direction the noise was coming from. As she was doing so, the sound turned to one that was more akin to a small child crying. She eventually located where the noise was coming from and began to approach it. To her disbelief, she saw a small creature, a child that had seemingly been abandoned. She quickly removed her shawl, reached down to pick up the child, and wrapped it in it. She quickly returned to her small apartment and named the baby Alashenka, and essentially began to treat as if it were her own offspring. The following day, however, when Tamara's daughter-in-law, who was also called Tamara, visited following a phone call from the elderly woman informing her that she had a new baby, she was horrified by what she saw. She would later describe the creature as being something that was not from this planet, and certainly didn't appear to be a human baby. The old lady's daughter-in-law found Alashenka's appearance decidedly unsettling. She recalled how it had a head that was too big for its body and onion-shaped. What's more, it had large eyes and only a small hole in its face that appeared to be some kind of nose. However, most disturbing of all, though, was when the elderly lady gave it food. The younger Tamara would later recall that she didn't once see the creature's mouth move while being fed, and that it appeared to suck up the food it was given. She would elaborate that it didn't eat the food as much as it consumed it. Regardless of her concerns as to exactly what her mother-in-law had found in the woods that night, Tamara left without incident. However, word of the strange creature soon got out around the village, not least because of the old lady's own accounts of her new baby. Although it isn't certain if one of the villagers reported her or if the authorities became aware of these rumors, but several weeks later, the elderly lady suddenly became ill. So much so, in fact, that she was hospitalized and ultimately admitted to a mental institution due to her odd behavior, and even odder statements of having left a baby at home in her apartment, claims hospital staff dismissed as crazy ramblings. It is here where there are several variations on what happened next. Most importantly, though, and a detail that remains constant throughout the slightly differing visions, is that the younger Tamara returned to her mother-in-law's apartment several days later. To her horror, she discovered Alashenka now dead. She would contact a mutual friend, Vladimir Nerdinov, who met her at the apartment. The pair were unsure of what to do and who to contact. Ultimately, they decided to inform a local policeman, Vladimir Bendlin. Although he was more than perplexed by the account they offered him, when confronted with the morose remains, he agreed to have them examined. He would take the remains to Dr. Irina Yermolevya, whose conclusions were that they were the mummified remains of a disfigured child, possibly a far-reaching consequence of the 1957 nuclear Kishtim disaster. However, when Bedlin asked another medical assistant, Lyubov Romania, to perform an examination of the remains, the conclusions were far different. Romuanova was an expert in child deformities, and her overriding findings were that the remains were simply not human. She would point out 20 key differences and anomalies in the skull of this creature, for example, and a human one, perhaps not least, that the creature's skull consisted of 4 separate bones with sharp edges, not at all how a human skull would be, disfigured or not. A short time after these findings, the rumors of an alien baby escaped the confines of the village and seeped out into the wider population of surrounding cities and eventually to other countries. Almost overnight, the small village became the focus of UFO researchers and enthusiasts, news channels and television stations, and just general onlookers. What's more, many of the television stations present were more than happy to pay people for their knowledge of Alashenka, meaning the story continued to grow by the minute. Particular attention was focused on Tamara and Vladimir Nerdinov, with some people accusing them of being perpetrators of a hoax. However, there was no evidence that either had gained monetarily from their claims. And what's more, tests on the remains had proven that it had indeed once been living tissue. Essentially, whatever Alashenka was, it was once alive. It was around this time that the case took a turn of sorts. Respected UFO researcher Boris Zolotiv arrived in the village. More importantly, he offered to have DNA testing undertaken on the remains. Bendlin agreed, and they were handed over to the ufologist, the remains never to be seen again. Incidentally, several months after he took charge of the remains of Alashenka, Zotolov was tracked down by a television station that had taken an interest in the case. He would offer, perhaps bizarrely, that his assistant was driving the remains to the lab when a UFO landed right in front of their car. What's more, the occupants got out of the craft and took the remains with them. How truthful the explanation offered for Alashenka's disappearance is open to debate. Some people have put forward that Zolotov arranged for the sale of the remains for financial gain, while others suggest that rather than aliens landing on the road to take charge of the remains, they somehow found their way into the possession of the Russian Secret Intelligence Service. We will likely never know for certain exactly what happened to them or where they might be today. There were, though, several final twists to the tale. Although the remains had disappeared, Bendlin would come into possession of the shawl that her mother-in-law had initially wrapped Alashenka in when a local woman, who wished to remain anonymous, came forward to say that she had taken it into her possession when the elderly lady was hospitalized. She happily handed the item over to Bendlin so that DNA tests could be carried out. When those tests were complete, the results were intriguing, to say the least. They would come back with two different sets of DNA on them. One of these was human, almost certainly the elderly lady's. The other, however, was a much more head-scratching, being classed as unknown to science. If we assume that the DNA was Alashenka's, which is almost certainly, then what exactly was this mysterious creature and where did it come from? A more disturbing twist occurred several months after the events had become worldwide news when the elderly lady somehow managed to escape from the mental health facility. She was, though, killed in a mysterious hit-and-run accident shortly after. Many people would question just how such an elderly lady could have freed herself from the facility in the first place, and suggested she might have been intentionally allowed to walk free in order that she could be assassinated. Of course, who might have been behind such a speculative targeted attack remains a mystery. Perhaps of even more concern is the fact that the elderly lady had arranged to meet hypnotic regression expert Mark Milkheimer at the hospital so that he could try to shine further light on the strange encounter. Only days after he arrived in Kishtim, shortly after Tamara's death, he died of a sudden heart attack, a death that also raised an eyebrow or two in some corners. Was Alashenka an alien baby that somehow became abandoned in the woodland near a Russian village? If so, were the remains taken back by those aliens, or were they intercepted by the Russian authorities? And how did it become to be left in the woodland in the first place? Was it left behind following an alien visitation, or does it suggest a more permanent extraterrestrial presence on our planet? Or was the incident indeed a case of a tragically deformed and abandoned child that was spun out of control by a thirsty media? The truth is, the tale of Alashenka will likely remain shrouded in mystery for the foreseeable future. Gremlins. They're nothing but fiction, right? The truth is, there are more accounts of real-life encounters with these beastly, mischievous, and sometimes deadly creatures than many of us perhaps realize. The earliest known mentioning of these truly bizarre creatures was an article in the Spectator newspaper in the early 1920s, which offered that the newly constituted Royal Air Force in the United Kingdom in 1918 had detected the existence of a horde of mysterious and malicious sprites, who would be responsible for a whole host of mysterious acts while pilots were in the air. Perhaps the earliest recorded encounter with these obscure beings took place in 1923, when a British pilot was forced to crash land his aircraft into the waters off the English coast. He would later state that his reason for doing so was due to a tiny creature which had followed him aboard his plane. The bizarre entity had played havoc with his ability to control the aircraft, eventually forcing him to ditch the plane in the sea. One of the most unsettling accounts on record concerning potential real-life gremlins, though, occurred in San Diego, California in the summer of 1939. A record of the incident can be found in the book Our Haunted Planet, where John Keel relays an account first published in the magazine Flying Saucer Review by Jerome Clark. According to the report, a United States military cargo plane left the runway at Marine Naval Air Station in San Diego on its way to Honolulu in Hawaii. To begin with, the flight was textbook, with no reason for concern. Then, 3 hours after takeoff, several panic distress calls were received by the control tower in San Diego before the cargo plane went completely silent. All attempts to re-establish contact with aircraft went unanswered. Then, a short time after the distress calls were received, the strange situation took an even more bizarre twist. Much to the disbelief of those at the naval base was the sight of the aircraft returning to the runway where it had taken off from a little over 3 hours earlier. Personnel watched as the aircraft approached the runway and made a perfect landing, eventually coming to a stop. Within moments, emergency response units were approaching the aircraft, as well as a security unit who quickly gained entry to the plane. They were not all prepared for the scene that would greet them. All of the crew were dead, each of them having a huge gaping wound in their torso, as if they'd been ripped open by a mysterious clawed beast. There was a similar damage done to the interior of the aircraft. Even stranger, any of the security unit who happened to touch these damaged parts of the plane would suffer a mysterious skin infection in the days that followed. The strangest and most bone-chilling discoveries, however, were made in the cockpit of the aircraft. There, the security unit found the pilot and co-pilot both dead, and both with the 45 automatic weapons in their hands, with several empty shell casings on the floor around them, as if they had spent their final moments firing at an unknown attacker. There was also a distinct thick odor of rotten eggs, something that is often noted at various encounters ranging from UFO sightings to the appearance of ghostly entities. Just how the pilots had managed to land the aircraft before succumbing to their deaths, and who the mysterious attacker was and where they had gone, remains unexplained. The encounter on the US cargo plane is far from the only one. In fact, as the 1940s unfolded and the Second World War took hold around many parts of the planet, many more apparent accounts with real-life gremlins surfaced. Interestingly or not, many of these encounters occurred during reconnaissance flights, which took place at particularly high altitudes. Consequently, the conditions were much more pressured and in colder atmosphere. Whether these high-altitude conditions contributed to the many reports is a topic of debate for some. The Ministry of Defense took these reports so seriously, however, that they at one point suspected the sightings of these creatures were the result of German forces. This was the case until the British and American Air Forces shared information, eventually realizing that they were each suffering from the same phenomenon, and furthermore, following the end of the war when Allied forces had access to German records, they discovered that German pilots had reported the exact same encounters. In fact, one of the most unsettling, if intriguing encounters involved an American pilot known only as LW. It was while LW was piloting a Boeing B-17 aircraft when he heard a strange noise that appeared to be coming from the aircraft's engine. He also noticed that his navigation equipment was suddenly malfunctioning. It was as he was going through checks of this equipment that he noticed a truly bizarre creature looking at him through the cockpit window, clinging onto the outside of the aircraft. He would later describe the creature as having grey-green pointed ears and eyes that glowed a bright red color. Most unnerving of all, however, was that the mouth was full of truly razor-sharp teeth. The pilot looked on in disbelief as a second, almost identical creature appeared on the nose of the aircraft. A moment later, LW snapped back into his senses and immediately began to dive before leveling out again, repeating this several times until the disturbing creatures seemingly lost their grip on his aircraft. After eventually landing his aircraft, LW decided he would keep the bizarre encounter to himself. However, he would later hear several fellow pilots speaking of seeing an almost identical beast, which prompted him to make an official report to his superiors. A researcher who gathered several further Second World War encounters with apparent real-life gremlins was John Laming, who spent considerable time with both British and Australian aviation industries. One of these encounters was of Captain Wickner, who was delivering an Avro Lancaster bomber to an airbase in the United Kingdom in August 1944 when his engines suddenly cut out without warning. Using all of his experience as a pilot, Wickner managed to guide the plane to an emergency landing at the next available airbase. However, as soon as the plane's wheels touched the runway, the engines roared into life once more. Even stranger, Wickner was replaced as the pilot to deliver the plane, which was placed under armed guard until the replacement pilot arrived. Did the authorities know more than they let on? Another curious encounter unfolded 2 years previously in 1942 when Chris Jarrett was piloting a Lancaster plane over northern France on its way to a night bombing mission over Germany. However, before reaching its target location, the plane's engines suddenly failed, one at a time, until all 4 of them had died. Still carrying its full arsenal of bombs and most of its fuel, the aircraft began its rapid descent towards the ground. At a complete loss as to why the engines had ceased working so suddenly, Jarrett launched himself from the stricken plane, landing just in time to see the aircraft disappear over a hill in the distance before it became enveloped in flames as it impacted the ground. These engine failures, most often with Lancaster bombers, occurred more than records might officially state, and rumors among the pilots and Air Force personnel blamed these mysterious creatures gremlins. Interestingly or not, in the years that followed the end of the Second World War, reports of these creatures began to slow down dramatically, eventually stopping altogether. Although we should note that, according to some researchers, many military authorities would forbid the respective pilots from speaking of any such encounters around the same time, which might explain the sudden slowdown in encounters. While all of the encounters we have examined so far have taken place in the air, arguably one of the most well-known encounters with apparently goblin-like entities that could be very well perceived as gremlins occurred on land at an isolated residence in Kentucky on the evening of August the 21st, 1955. Interestingly enough, around the same time the aerial encounters began to slow down. On the night in question, the Sutton and Taylor family were enjoying an evening at the Suttons' home when, following a sighting of a strange glowing object that appeared to land in the nearby woods, they found their house surrounded by bizarre troll-like creatures with rat-like ears, long arms and clawed fingers and a row of sharp teeth. What followed was a standoff of sorts between the families and the strange creatures, which saw several shots fired at them by some members of the household. Bizarrely, the bullets appeared to bounce off these creatures as if they were made of bulletproof material. These menacing entities eventually retreated, and the entire episode remains unexplained almost 3/4 of a century later. Might the bizarre creatures that terrorized the 2 families that night in Kentucky have been the same mysterious entities that had harassed so many pilots in the air while in flight over the previous decades? Could it be possible that gremlins, grey-green goblin-like creatures bent on causing mischief with the potential to attack with their sharp claws and razor-like teeth really exist, and not simply be a fictional Hollywood creation? And if so, when will they show themselves again, and where? To most people, the idea of a zombie outbreak taking place among the world's population belongs in the realms of science fiction. And for the most part, that would be correct. The fact is, however, although it might look different to how it is portrayed in the movies, the potential of a zombie outbreak in the real world is not as far-fetched as we may think. The origins of many accounts of zombies reside in many of the ancient voodoo legends and rituals of the indigenous tribes of Africa. As the slave trade ripped people from their homeland and distributed them around the world, these legends and rituals came with them. Many of these legends flourished in the southern regions of the United States, particularly in Louisiana, where there's a long history of voodoo and magic rituals, including the ability to turn a person into a zombie. Another location that saw claims of zombies increase over the decades is Haiti, although rather than voodoo, the practice here is known as hoodoo. What's more, many of these accounts and claims can be found in our modern era, with the belief in zombies being widespread in the country. And it's to some of these claims that we'll turn our attention to next. One person who has researched claims of zombies in Haiti more than most is Zorex Neil Hurston, who spent years in the 1920s and 30s speaking with locals, as well as hoodoo priests. In fact, she would become so trusted by the people at the time that she was invited on several occasions to witness some of the hoodoo rituals up close. It was during one of these rituals that she claimed to have seen a dead woman named Felicia Felix Mentor brought back from the dead. She would state in her book, Tell My Horse, that the woman had a blank face with dead eyes and was a truly dreadful sight. Ultimately, Hurston would claim that zombies in Haiti were very real and that she herself had seen people called back from the dead. In more recent times, in the 1980s, Harvard University's Wade Davis spent considerable time in Haiti studying the legends and rituals of zombies. And like Hurston, he too spent considerable time with hoodoo priests, as well as researching the ancient roots of the rituals they would perform. He would claim, for example, that in ancient times, criminals would be turned into zombies as punishment for their crimes. This was largely done, David offered, by the use of ancient toxic herbs, plants, and powders. These practices, he would claim, were still carried out today, albeit unofficially, although the makeup of the natural toxins remained a secret to the hoodoo priests only. There were some claims, although none with any proof, that the military took an interest in the notion that a person could be turned into a zombie through the use of natural toxins, something which is perhaps not that much of a stretch of the imagination. As much as an intentional mix of toxic ingredients could very well turn a person into a zombie, according to the research of Peter Cummings from Boston University, the conditions of the planet are potentially perfect for a virus to mutate and take hold among the human population that could then create zombies. Cummings would specifically offer that should a virus mutate in such a way that it affected the frontal lobe of the brain and shut it down, then this would return the mindset to a primal one, essentially a zombie-like state. While this might sound far-fetched and highly unlikely, there are incidents on record during the time of the Spanish flu, where some patients mysteriously deteriorated into a catatonic-like state until any type of interaction with another person, which would result in an almost attack-like response. Maybe our understanding of the potential possibilities of a zombie outbreak in the human population would be increased by examining such cases in the animal world. Many of these cases involve parasites entering the food chain of a specific insect, for example, which in turn enters the insect's nervous system. This results in the parasite taking control of its movements and actions. In a bizarre twist, in some cases, these movements are designed so that the insect will itself be eaten by a larger animal, and so the parasite travels even further. Of course, this alone, potentially at least, could mean such a zombie-causing parasite could enter our own food chain, either directly or indirectly. That this zombie-like state exists in the animal world is well documented, and without doubt, it's certainly food for thought. We mentioned earlier how the possibility of viruses mutating and creating, for all intents and purposes, zombies. However, it's a notion that is worth examining a little further, not least as it's much more of a realistic, if unlikely, possibility than most of us might think. As Samita Andriansky from the University of Miami states, it would only take a virus such as rabies to mutate to result in someone showing symptoms that many would associate with zombification. And these dire warnings were compounded by the knowledge that should such a virus mutate in such a way, it would very likely rip through the global population. Essentially, it could very well cause a global zombie outbreak. Another idea that might at first sound like it comes out of a science fiction movie is a zombie-causing virus could arrive on Earth from outer space. While that is indeed extremely unlikely, it is certainly not impossible that a bacteria or virus from elsewhere in the solar system, or even the universe, could find its way to our planet and then mutate and spread. Some researchers have even proposed that such a zombie-causing virus existing in the reaches of space could be the reason that aliens haven't visited Earth, such as Stephen Kane of San Francisco State University. Indeed, as unlikely as it might be, such a possibility is a grim and sobering one. Although it is perhaps equally unlikely, we might also consider the notion that a zombie outbreak could intentionally be induced by one intelligence agency or another, possibly through a combination of drugs and mind control techniques. We know, for example, that the CIA spent considerable time looking at such ideas as mind control in their MK Ultra program. Could it be possible, if such knowledge was at their disposal, that future wars could be fought and won by turning the enemy into zombies and so rendering them unable to fight? While that might indeed seem like stuff of science fiction movies, one thing we can be sure of is, if it was something at a military's disposal, they would almost certainly use it. Although there is most likely a rational explanation, in 2011 a gentleman by the name of Gordon Lubold would reveal leaked classified United States military documents that appeared to lay out a military response to a zombie outbreak. Given that the documents were now in the public arena, the military saw fit to issue an official response. They would state that such terms as evil zombies was, in fact, a reference for any particular target, which made the document adaptable for multiple situations they might wish to train for. There was also the issue of not wanting to highlight any particular target for foreign relations purposes. What should we make of this explanation? Does it make sense? Or might there really be a plan to deal with a literal zombie outbreak? Was an entire family abducted from their vehicle on a lonely road somewhere in Georgia as they traveled from Tennessee to Florida in 1968. The Falcon family, a father, mother, and their 4-year-old son, Celestian, were traveling from Tennessee to their would-be new home in Florida, the result of Celestian's father's sudden transfer to the Sunshine State by the military. While they made their way along a road somewhere in the state of Georgia, Celestian noticed a strange glowing object in the sky following them no more than 200 yards away. The young boy watched the object for several moments, and when he heard his mother let out a sharp scream, he realized that she had seen it too. At around the same time, the object began to move closer to their moving car. Celestian noticed that there were several large red lights on its underside, while on the top half came a paler glow that appeared to emanate from several windows. He also noticed how other motorists were speeding up to get away from the strange object, or even performing U-turns to go the other way. All, that is, except one vehicle which came to stop at the side of the road a short distance away. As Celestian watched this car, he noticed that the engine of their own vehicle had suddenly cut out, and they came to a stop a short distance away. He noticed his father looking in the rearview mirror, watching both the obscure object now hovering a short distance away and the other motorist behind them. With that, his father reached for his gun from inside the glove box and opened the car door. The instant his father stepped foot outside the vehicle, the object moved from where it was to directly over him. His father rushed back inside the car and attempted to start the engine several times, all of which failed. As this was happening, Celestian's mother pushed him further down into the back seat, telling him to remain still and not to make a sound. Even from where he sat, however, he could still see clearly out of the backseat window of the vehicle. He could see the other car that had pulled over to the side of the road just before them, and he noticed that the motorist, like his father, had also gotten out of his vehicle. Then, from out of nowhere, several strange alien creatures, each around 5 feet tall, approached and surrounded the man. Celestian watched as the unfortunate man struck out at one of the creatures with what appeared to be a tire iron. Before he could make contact, though, one of the figures touched a bizarre silver prod to his body, which clearly and immediately paralyzed him. They then proceeded to wrap the man and his girlfriend in strange silver blankets before sending them into the air and into their awaiting craft. As he watched the scene unfold a short distance away, a bright pink light suddenly shined down on their own car. A moment later, the car door opened and a bizarre-looking hand reached inside. At this point, Celestian blacked out. When he awoke, he appeared to be inside the spacecraft. And of more concern, he had been separated from his family, who remained together in another part of the room. He could still hear his mother screaming hysterically. The next thing he realized, a reptilian-like alien was carrying him down a set of stairs and into another large room. This one had large windows on one side and an operating light table in the middle. When he managed to glance out of the window, he could see the road they had been driving on outside. When he cast his eyes back around the room, however, he was met with a particularly grim sight. Against the walls, including beneath the windows, he could see row upon row of jars that contained human fetuses. There were also several doorways that led out of this main room. For reasons he couldn't understand, he knew these rooms were cold storage rooms like walk-in refrigerators. He noticed his family had also been brought into this room. His mother, still very much hysterical, was placed on the table and a large silver needle was used to inject her. She instantly fell calm. Before Celestian could see anything else, he was taken out of the room by the reptilian creature and through one of the waiting doorways. As he entered this room, he squinted his eyes at how bright it was. He could make out more reptilian creatures that were seemingly engaged in activities near a control panel. However, it is what he could hear that was of most concern to the young boy. He could hear a woman scream in a room next door to where he stood, as well as the shouts of a man pleading for help, saying, "We're being attacked by monsters." As this was happening, Celestian noticed the two grey alien creatures had entered the room. Bizarrely, each was wearing a NASA-style spacesuit, complete with helmets on their heads. Even stranger, a human in a dark business suit also appeared. At this point, Celestian was on the verge of mental collapse. This mysterious man began speaking to the other creatures in the room, although he appeared to do so telepathically. What is particularly strange was that Celestian could also hear and understand this telepathic communication. According to what he could remember, the alien entities were searching for an alien device that had become lost in the muddy swamps of Georgia. They had, he recalled, found part of this device, but were still missing a section of it, and so another search was ordered by the human. Celestian was taken through several rooms before eventually stopping in a particularly busy part of the ship. All around him was a hive of activity, as if some kind of emergency was taking place. He picked up further snippets of information, most predominantly that their craft had been discovered and somebody was on their way to destroy them. At this point, Celestian felt a real surge of panic go through him, a panic he believed that he picked up from the occupants of the craft themselves. Another voice strayed into his head, stating that whoever was on their way, they were getting close. Then, on a screen on the wall, video of two United States Air Force fighter jets appeared. Several of the creatures turned to watch the screen. Celestian would later recall that it was so close up and detailed that he could clearly see the pilots' faces through the glass of the cockpit. He could also sense that these jets were approaching the alien craft and their intent was to attack and destroy it. Activity exploded all around the young boy, who simply stood in the room watching what was taking place. All the while, snippets of telepathic communication between the alien entities went through his mind. They planned to travel back in time by 40 minutes to before the radar had picked them up, and so avoid the ensuing confrontation. Suddenly, one of the entities picked up Celestian and strapped him to a silver table. He must have been administered some kind of injection, as he blacked out a moment later. When he awoke, a human in the suit was standing over him, and he and his family were being led back to their car. Although he wasn't certain, he had the impression that several experiments had been performed on him while he was moving in and out of consciousness. As they sat in the car, his parents appeared to be in apparent trance-like state. Things remained calm for several moments before his mother and father appeared to snap back to the moment. His mother immediately started screaming, urging her husband to step on the gas and get them out of there, which he duly did. As Celestian looked out of the rear window, he could see the object rise into the air and disappear into the sky. As the years went on, both his parents would refuse to speak about the night in question, or to even acknowledge that it ever happened. However, strange incidents would continue around the family home, including the sudden appearance of grey alien entities that would appear in Celestian's room in the middle of the night as if they had walked right through the bedroom wall. During these encounters, his parents would often awaken in a similar trance state as they were being led back to their car following their abduction. And on one occasion, a neighbour even claimed to have seen a bizarre object hovering over the top of their home. It would appear that Celestian was the target of repeat alien abductions for some time following that initial encounter on a lonely Georgia highway. If the Falcon family alien abduction is true, it gives us plenty to consider. Not least that a systematic and planned abduction program is taking place for reasons unknown to us. And what's more, there appears to be a human presence to these abductions. Even more remarkable, these alien entities that feature both reptilian and grey alien creatures have the apparent ability to travel back in time. On how many occasions might this have happened? And might this explain why these bizarre crafts are there 1 minute and gone the next? Above all else, though, we have to ask, what is the end goal of these apparent systematic abductions, and will they be for the benefit or the detriment of humanity?